So what I thought I would do in talking about capital punishment is to start off by mentioning that there are at least two very different theories of what punishment is supposed to be for. So one theory is sometimes called the utilitarian theory, and that one says that the purpose of punishment is social benefit. So, the rationale that we have for punishing people who have been convicted of crimes is to bring about some kind of social benefit. So, examples of possible social benefit would include incapacitating criminals. So, if you've got someone who's going around committing murders, committing rapes, or what have you, if they are apprehended and locked up, then we are safe from them. So, that's the idea of incapacitation. Crime deterrence, the idea there is that by having penalties for committing crimes, some would-be criminals might be dissuaded from committing the crime. It's like they're thinking, okay, I want to commit this crime, but if I get caught, I might be punished, and I don't want that, so then I won't commit the crime. So that's the crime deterrence idea. And then finally, rehabilitation. So some people have thought that a good thing to do in a system of punishment, if you've got someone confined in jail or what have you, then maybe they could get some job training or some education or some medical help or some psychiatric help or what have you. Now that's expensive. And because of that, we're not doing that as much as we used to in the United States. So I'm going to come back and talk about the utilitarian theory in connection with the death penalty in just a minute. But first, I'll mention the other prominent theory, and that is called the retributivist theory. And that's the one that says the purpose of punishment is simply to administer justice. So now we're not talking about social benefit like deterrence or anything like that. The idea is that justice involves giving people what they deserve. So if you, excuse me, if you have done the best job in some contest, then you deserve the first place trophy as a matter of justice. So you do something positive, you should get a positive outcome, praise or a reward or whatever it might be. And then similarly, it is claimed that if you commit a crime, you deserve to be punished as a matter of justice. So that's what the retributivist theory is about. So I'm going to talk about those two theories in connection with capital punishment. So let's start with the utilitarian theory. So if you remember, I mentioned these three benefits that utilitarians think you can sometimes get with punishment. Two of them really don't work for capital punishment. You don't need to execute people to incapacitate them. Again, if someone's going out committing murder or committing rape or what have you, if they are locked up, that prevents them from doing that. You don't need to execute them to incapacitate them. And then obviously you can't achieve rehabilitation with capital punishment. If you kill someone, obviously you're not rehabilitating them. So with utilitarianism, the issue kind of comes down to crime deterrence. So then the big question is, do you get greater crime deterrence with capital punishment than you do with the alternatives, such as a long prison sentence? So there's been a lot of social science research on this. And while there is not a complete consensus, by far the majority of the studies that have been done have concluded that there's no evidence that you get greater deterrent value with capital punishment as opposed to lesser penalties. So the kinds of studies that have been done, I mean, the initial studies were just doing things like comparing similar states, states that have a similar demographic, similar population density, similar economic levels, that kind of thing, where one has capital punishment and the other does not, and you find there's not a difference in the murder rate. or you look at a state that didn't have capital punishment and then it instituted it, or a state that had it and then abolished it, you don't see any significant change in the murder rate. And there are other more sophisticated studies where you look at a whole bunch of different variables. A very small number of those have claimed to find a deterrent effect to capital punishment, but as I mentioned, the vast majority of them do not. They conclude we can't find any deterrent value in capital punishment beyond what you get from other punishments. So then we go to the various common sense arguments that are made, because some people say, you know, social science is very difficult. It's hard to know what is the cause of what. There are so many factors that might influence the crime rate. So it's hard to isolate exactly what is the effect of capital punishment versus other factors. So I'm going to give you what might be called a kind of common sense argument that capital punishment is a uniquely effective crime deterrent, but then I'll give you a rebuttal to that argument. So the argument that it is a uniquely effective crime deterrent goes like this. The first premise is the more you are afraid of something, the more you want to avoid it, then the more deterrent value you will get from imposing that penalty. So think about like a parking violation. If the penalty for a parking violation is just $2, a lot of people aren't that afraid of having to pay a $2 fine. So if they want to park there, they'll just park there. Whereas if it's a $50 fine, they'd think twice about it unless they're pretty rich. If you make it a $1,000 fine, that's going to have more deterrent value. You can see where this is going. So then the argument is people are more afraid of death, more afraid of being executed than they are of going to prison. And there is actually some evidence to support that. For example, people who are sentenced to death, often on appeal, will request that the sentence be reduced to a long prison sentence, whereas it's more rare for it to go the other way. Someone who's been sentenced to a long prison sentence asking instead to be executed. That does sometimes happen, but it's much more rare. So you put those two premises together. Premise one, the more you're afraid of something, the more the threat of it deters you. People are more afraid of being executed than of going to prison for a long time. Therefore, you get more deterrent value with capital punishment. So that's a kind of common sense argument for it. But I can give you a rebuttal to that argument. The rebuttal is a little more complicated, but it goes like this. The logic of deterrence depends on people having a certain degree of rationality and a certain degree of self-control. So rationality, they have to actually be thinking, okay, I want to kill this person, but on the other hand, I don't want to be caught and convicted and sentenced to death. Now I'm going to weigh these against each other. That's a fairly high degree of rationality. And you also need self-control. Oftentimes when someone commits a murder, it's because they are enraged, they're furious, they're jealous, they're, you know, whatever it is, they have this violent impulse. So for deterrence to work, you have to be able to control that violent impulse. You have to have self-control. So then one more concept is what I need to finish this argument, and that is the concept of a threshold. So let's go back to the parking violation thing. So I'll use myself as an example. If there's a fine for parking in the wrong place on my campus and the fine is $2, that's not going to deter me. If I'm in a hurry, if I might be late for class, I don't mind risking a $2 fine. If it's a $50 fine, that's good. You know, I'll think twice about that. If it's a $1,000 fine, I'm definitely not going to do it. I can't afford to pay a $1,000 fine. If it's a year in prison, I'd be so afraid of that, I probably wouldn't even dare park on campus. So notice this, though. I'm more afraid of 2 years in prison than 1. I'm more afraid of 5 years than 2, and so on. But at a certain point, you've reached a threshold where I am deterred. Okay, I'm scared enough of that. I'm not going to do it. So even if I'm more scared of an even harsher penalty, you get no extra deterrent value because you've already deterred me. So now let's put these points together. And the argument, the rebuttal to that common sense argument would go something like this. Anyone who is rational and who has self-control is very likely to be deterred by the threat of a long prison sentence. Going to prison for a long time is no picnic. That's a really bad deal. So someone who's rational and has self-control, and they're in a situation where they actually have a desire to kill someone, they're likely to be deterred by that. On the other hand, people who don't have rationality and self-control, they can't be deterred by anything. So in order for capital punishment to get you this unique deterrent value, you'd have to be talking about a person who would be reasoning this way. I want that person dead so badly, I'm willing to spend the rest of my life in prison to see them dead, but I'm not willing to be executed for it. That's probably a vanishingly small number of people, and perhaps it's the null set, perhaps it's no one. One other point that sort of buttresses this is already there are all kinds of dangers of dying and committing crimes. You probably know that in America, more so than just about any other country in the world, lots of people have guns. So if you break into someone's house, if you're a burglar, there's a good chance of being shot if someone is at home. Also, the police kill people in the act of committing crimes at a very high rate also. So it's hard to understand how the threat of a remote execution is going to bring about greater deterrent value than you already get from things like that. Further evidence for that, there's a lot of research to show that whereas people can be deterred by immediate threats, not so much distant threats, distant in time. If you want to do something and it's not going to hurt you in the short run, but it might hurt you 10 years later, that doesn't seem to deter people. Think of all the unhealthy things people do. Smoking cigarettes, for example, driving without wearing their seatbelt and so on. If there's not an immediate threat of a bad consequence, there seems to be little deterrent effect. So as I see it, the evidence, not only does the social science evidence not seem to indicate that capital punishment is a uniquely effective crime deterrent, but these common sense arguments don't really go in that direction either. Now, there's another kind of argument that some proponents of capital punishment use where they think it has a uniquely effective crime deterrent. So these are people who say, yeah, our opponents, the enemies of capital punishment, they probably have a good point about rationality and self-control and so on, but maybe it works more like this. It's about social messaging. When you just send someone to jail, you're kind of sending the message that what they did is not absolutely intolerable. We'll continue to let them live. Odds are eventually we'll let them out of prison and they can resume normal life. So these people who make this argument, they say, we kind of send the message that what they did, although it's bad, it's tolerable. But when you execute someone, you're saying what you did is absolutely intolerable. We're no longer willing to share the planet with you. You must die. And so some defenders of capital punishment think that message gets internalized. So even if you're dealing with someone who's not very rational, doesn't have much self-control, they might still just sort of internalize the message that murder is just absolutely beyond the pale. You can't be, you're just an awful person if you commit murder, and so they won't do it. But there's a rebuttal to this argument as well. And the rebuttal is that it's a mixed message. On the one hand, yeah, I suppose there is this message that murder is absolutely intolerable. But there's also the message that the proper way to deal with bad people is violence, is to kill them. And so the logic of deterrence sort of implies that if you're a would-be criminal, you're identifying with the person being executed and saying, I don't want to be like him. I don't want to be executed. I don't want to be a bad person the way he is. What if you instead identify with the state? Hey, look at what they're doing to this bad guy. They're killing him. That's what we ought to do with bad people, kill them. Someone in my life I'm dealing with is a bad person. That's an appropriate way to deal with that person, by killing them. So the message is at best mixed. So that's what I wanted to say about the utilitarian argument. Just to sum up, the other two values of utilitarianism, incapacitation and rehabilitation, they don't support capital punishment. The only one that has a fighting chance is crime deterrence. But both the social science research and the common sense arguments, I think, suggest it probably is not a more effective crime deterrent than alternatives. Now, I do have things to say about retributivism, and I have other points to make about capital punishment.